Good morning, everyone. I think I'm going to diverge from my prepared remarks a bit and just talk and not be so formal. But I'm going to do something a little different. I'm not going to talk about the types of policy solutions that are needed to address racial wealth inequality, but I'm going to talk about what is needed to ensure that we can advance the type of policy proposals that will address racial wealth inequality. And I want to start by, and I said I wasn't going to do this, but I have to. How does this thing work? Do this one? This one? Okay. I'm going to start with a bit of data. One of the things that I think is sorely needed right now is for us to address research and narratives that continue to challenge, that we need to challenge these narratives that interprets the wealth gap as a matter of choice and agency as opposed to inheritance and structure. We still have a lot to overcome in thinking about how we talk about racial wealth inequality. And it's misleading to state that differences in wealth by race is due to whites having more of a diverse asset portfolio when it's actually wealth itself that leads to that diverse portfolio in the first place. So we still have data that continues to explain the racial wealth gap with the racial wealth gap. I know that doesn't sound quite right, but that's exactly what's happening. It is actually unearned birthright of inheritance or other family transfers that actually has the biggest effect on wealth accumulation. If we know that, and we continue to have narratives that are telling people of color that there's something inherently wrong with you, that you somehow just don't know how to make the right choices, that somehow your behavior is not quite right, then we're not going to be able to advance the kind of policy proposals that will have the greatest impact on wealth inequality. We have to start there. We were really pleased at Insight to partner with two of our long-standing members of our network, Sandy Darity at Duke and Derek Hamilton at the New School, to actually take this issue. And we called our report that was just released, Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain. Studying and working hard, why it isn't enough for Black Americans. And we chose that title for a couple of reasons, but we have to get the issue of causality right. And we haven't quite gotten that right yet, although we've been doing this work for a number of years. We still thought it was very important that we address the issue of education, of income, and employment as typical explanations for the drivers of the racial wealth gap. And so this short brief that's about 6 pages uses some SIP data, some referenced here today, that data set, to just look at some very basic data around this issue. So I'm just going to show a couple of slides. And basically, I don't have to say much to show that Blacks with a college degree have far less wealth than whites who have dropped out of high school. And it's not that education and higher education is not important, but we can't continue to use that as a sole driver, as a solution alone to address racial wealth inequality. We also know that jobs are not necessarily the driver. And some of this data is not necessarily too new. Some of you may have read a recent report by Tom Shapiro and Demos that talks about these issues. But certainly when we talk about people who work hard, we look at Black Americans and see that basically they have far less wealth when they're working full-time than whites who are jobless and basically have no wealth if they are unemployed or discouraged. So we have to look past the issue of hard work. And finally, income. When we look at income, we know that basically middle-class Blacks have less wealth than lower income whites. And so we can't just look at income and say if two groups have $50,000, this is how their wealth plays out. So we're using this as just one example of how we need to shift the narrative around what's really impacting race and wealth in this country. And kind of on that note, I'm going to flip back to this. I think our unusual partnership, some scholars coming together with an advocacy and research organization, was to push our work forward and to think about language in a new way. And for academics, we know that there's a certain type of academic speak. And for advocates, we have a certain type of language. And we came together to try to figure out how we could speak as one voice. So another issue that we really have to tackle if we want to really think about how to address race and wealth in this country is the need for greater capacity to talk about the intersection of race, gender, wealth, the role of government, and inequality, some of the toughest issues to frame around. So we've only begun to touch the surface of this issue, although at Insight we've been trying to tackle this issue for about 3 years. So the umbrellas don't make it rain is a metaphor. And we know from working with cognitive linguists, which is a field that's dedicated to how people process information and communicate, that we're learning how to examine how people reason, how they formulate judgments, and come to conclusions about economic inequality. If we don't understand that, then how can our language be able to support the very policies we're trying to put forward? One of the things that we really are learning is that words do matter, and I get a lot of pushback from this. What difference does it make? Well, it does make a difference. Priming people with varying metaphors has been shown to alter not just how they speak, but the way they decide unconsciously about what ought to be done. And that's what we're really trying to push for, to really understand how people think unconsciously. And we know that words matter. It's been shown that even if you alter the label for people that we use all the time, like African American or Black, that has been shown to alter assumptions and policy preferences right off the bat. So the second thing we need to do is be better at talking about race broadly and talking about the intersection of the issues I just named. I also want to talk a bit about research. And although we've come a long way, and we hear a lot of data about the racial wealth gap. I can't even tell you, maybe 4 times a week I get Google alerts about the racial wealth gap. We still have so far to go in really understanding what's happening in our communities and within and across various groups. And so, will research really help and transform solutions? I think it will, but we have to go deeper and further. The Honorable Judy Chu spoke to the issue of not having the type of data that helps us understand the most significant growing number of folks in our country. So I was just going to say real quickly, because I've got the sign, I got to stop, and I'm only halfway done, is that new data that's being put out called the National Asset Scorecard in Communities of Color is doing just that. We're very excited about it because for the first time we'll be able to look at groups that we've never had any data on before. We'll be able to look across different cities of this country, and I'm really excited about some upcoming research that's going to come out of LA, and Melanie De La Cruz is here from UCLA, who's working on that project. And we'll be able to learn a lot about Asian subgroups there. We'll be able to learn a lot about Mexican Americans in LA and compare them to other groups across the country. And I'm going to say something really quick because I know that I have to stop. But I think there are a couple of other things we have to think about. One, if we really want to start to think about national change, we've got to look locally, because that's where the change is happening. And we know that there's so much exciting work that's happening. And not all the solutions, the bigger solutions would come from national policy, but on the ground right now, there are people at work that are doing exciting work. I think the work around options for retirement savings for private workers that is taking hold, is such exciting work at the state level, and if it's passed in various states, we're talking about scale. There's others, and I would love to talk about them, but I can't. But I want to say another thing before I stop. If we don't begin to invest in the very people that are doing this work, then we're not going to make the progress we need. We still do not have a great pipeline for younger people of color to come into this work. I can remember when I worked in DC several years ago, I was the only black person who could talk about blacks and welfare reform, the only black person in DC, and apparently across the country, which sounds absolutely crazy, but we still do not have a pipeline to help younger leaders come into this work on race and wealth inequality. And secondly, we have to invest in smaller organizations on the ground. We're losing them. We're losing them. We're scrambling for funding, we're piecing things together, we're trying to partner with other smaller organizations, and it's becoming much, much difficult, and we're seeing so many organizations close their doors because they don't have the kind of funding to do this work. And if we do not have those folks on the ground, none of this is going to happen. It's not possible. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop right there because I know I'm out of time. Thank you.